Unit 3, Development, also referred to in some texts as Economic Development. Your content objectives today, there are two. 3.1, explain why development varies amongst countries. 2, compare and contrast the development of less developed countries and more developed countries. Keep in mind when we talk about development, in the 1900s there was mostly global military alliances, and they've been replaced by global economic development, which is going back to Unit 1 when we talk about globalization and the shrinking of the world within this global economy. The ICANN statements: 1. Explain the spectrum of development characteristics of LDCs, so less developed countries, more developed countries, and NICs, which are newly industrialized countries. 2. Define the United Nations Human Development Index for development. And 3rd, identify and explain measurements of the 3 different human development indicators. All right, when we look at development according to the United Nations, oftentimes they look at access to wealth, education, health, and technology resources. Often, and they fall along this spectrum. And the spectrum moves left to right, where you have less developed countries that show the least amount of development in wealth, education, health, and technology. Then newly industrialized countries are countries that have developed in those areas, and then more developed countries that have high rankings in all those areas. The Cold War era divided the world into 3 worlds. These are commonly not used today. They're not in the newer texts. When we look at HDI, they have economic indicators, social and demographic indicators. It's created by the United Nations. Keep in mind the United Nations is the largest supranational organization with over 192 countries that participate in the 2 bodies of the United Nations. When they look at economic indicators, they focus on gross domestic product. When they look at social indicators, they look at literacy and education. And then demographic factors, they look at life expectancy. The scale they use is 0, which is the lowest ranking, and 1 is a perfect ranking within the HDI rankings. The highest country currently is Norway with 0.97, and then the lowest is Niger in sub-Saharan Africa with 0.34. Here we have classifications of Human Development Index. So the United Nations has indicators. They also have the broad categorizations of more developed, newly industrialized countries and less developed countries. Although those aren't commonly used today in text, we look at classifications such as very high developed, which are found in core regions, which we'll talk about later in Rostow's and Wallerstein's model, such as North America, Western Europe, and Australia and Oceania. The high developed regions are going to be those that are in DTM Stage 3, which we learned from Unit 2. Those would be countries in South America, Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and parts of North Africa and Southwest Asia. The medium developed countries are going to be found in the lower latitudes, with countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and then low developed will be found predominantly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Here is a table of HDI rankings. When we look at economic indicators, the focus is on gross domestic product. What is gross domestic product? It's the value of goods, manufactured goods and services produced within a country, in the boundaries of a country within an annual basis. They divide it by the population to give a per capita GDP, which is the mean income of wealth per person, which can be somewhat skewed because it doesn't show the distribution of wealth. Again, this can be a skewed statistic because it does not show the distribution of wealth. They also look at categories of jobs, or also referred to as sectors. Primary sector are extracting resources from earth, such as farmers, fishers, miners, etc. And then secondary is manufacturing output. So they take these extracted resources from earth and they create a manufactured output. And those are industrial manufacturers that create consumer tangible goods. And the third sector is tertiary sector. So they take those goods and now they move them between people. So they're in the form of retailers, bankers, healthcare workers. And usually in tertiary sector jobs mostly require a higher education or post-secondary education beyond high school. The access to goods they also look at. So the access to cell phones, cars, computers, and televisions. which are called a partial market basket of goods. Here we look at the distribution of GDP in the world, so we can see GDP is highest in North America as well as Saudi Arabia. And then this map is a little bit, I'm not sure the year, but the second highest GDP in 2020 is actually China. Per capita GDP, we can see the mean wealth, where people have the highest wealth on average, are going to be in the core countries: North America, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and Australia, Oceania, and Japan. What does employment tell us about development? Well, when we look at these pie charts, we can see that in the United States, over 75% of jobs are in the tertiary service sector. That tells us that there's advancement in education. It also tells us there's advancement in technology and healthcare services. Whereas you move to a country that would be a DTM Stage 3 country like Brazil, and they have the primary and secondary about half the pie, and then tertiary is the other half, which shows us that they're not as advanced technologically and also within education. And then if we look at Nepal, where 81% is primary jobs, that tells us Nepal are subsistent farmers. That means most of their production is not for sale. Their crops are not for sale in the global market, but they are consumed on the farm. Here we look at a line graph, and it shows us the trends as we move through the 21st century. We can see that tertiary is on the rise in both MDCs and LDCs, so we have more services that are provided for people. We have a higher demand for post-secondary education, and we see a decline in secondary manufacturing and also extracting resources from earth, such as the primary sector. Compared to the DTM stage, because the DTM stage will tell us a lot in terms of where a country is developed. Remember, the DTM stage tells us the economic development of a country. When the natural increase rate is high, like in stage 2, it tells us more people live in rural areas, there's less economic development in urban areas. That it also tells us that there's going to be lower stressed importance of education beyond high school or equivalent to high school. And then as they move to stage 3, now we know women enter the workforce. Women have more say in the families. They have less children. And then when we get to stage 4, now we see lower populations. People are having, like we talked about in Unit 2, they have the natural increase rate of about 2.1, sorry, 2.1. All right, technology distribution. We look at the concentration found in eastern, well, with cell phones. Cell phones can be a little tricky, though, because cell phones is also known as technological leapfrogging. So that means you can set up cell phone towers anywhere, and it doesn't take a whole lot of infrastructure and money. But we can see cell phones are found in areas that are rapidly growing, economically growing countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Eastern European countries, and Eurasia. All right, the social indicators look at education and literacy. And when they look at literacy, they're looking at the percentage of people that are literate within the primary language. In the student-teacher ratio, they're looking for a low student-to-teacher ratio, and that will tell us the spectrum ranking of a country. And health and welfare, they'll look at nutrition and calorie consumption. They'll look at hospitals per person, doctors per person, nurses per person. They'll look at also healthcare expenditure, but not always, because healthcare expenditures can be misleading because they're not appropriated the same from country to country. When we look at student-teacher ratio, we can see patterns here, and they match our population patterns and our DTM stage patterns. We can see that DTM stage 4 countries have a low student-teacher ratio, and we can see that as well as in Europe, both Northern, Western, and Eastern Europe, and then also Saudi Arabia. When we look at other areas of the U.S., we can see that there are regional variations, such as in Woodbury. When we look at the student-teacher ratio, it's over 40 per student, which according to the United Nations would give us a low ranking within the indicator of education. Doctors per person, again, we follow similar patterns. We can see that in some areas of the world they have more doctors per person, such as Western and Northern Europe, Russian Federation, and down in Argentina. So there's areas that have more physicians per person than what are standard core countries like North America or Australia and New Zealand. All right, let's continue with 3.1. Explain why development varies amongst countries. That's your content objective. Your ICANN statements explain the measurements of GDI, gross or Gender Development Index, in measuring gender inequality. 2. List key factors for the demographic indicators to Human Development Index, such as life expectancy or infant mortality rate. 3. Compare and contrast gender inequality and other demographic indicators between MDCs and LDCs. All right, let's talk about gender inequality. What's one measurement? One measurement used by the United Nations is Gender Development Index. The main overview when we look at gender equality, according to the United Nations, there's no country that has equality between genders. MDCs have generally higher equality than LDCs, generally, not always, but generally, because what we already talked about, when Unit 2 with population and DTM stages, a country will be in stage 4, and we know women enter the workforce by stage 4. So they're going to have less children, they're going to live in urban areas. GDI is taking HDI numbers, but just breaking it between the two genders. So there will be an HDI score for women called the GDI, and then there will be an HDI score for men, the GDI score for males. And it'll compare income, education, life expectancy, all the variables to the key indicators. Gender Development Index, we can see the same pattern. As we just talked about, they're going to be found in DTM Stage 4 countries, or core countries that have the highest development: North America, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And income, but we can see that some highly developed countries, there isn't a perfect gender inequality index. And we can see that with female income to male income. We can see that parts of sub-Saharan Africa, women earn almost as much as a male. And then we can see in Australia, a woman earns closer to a male's wage, which is much higher than the United States. And health. Again, we look at the number of the longevity of females. So we can see that in Russian Federation, women live longer than men, 10 years or longer. Politics, women in parliament positions or political positions of power. We can see that that's a very low ranking in the United States compared to both our neighbors of Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Each of those countries have more women in political power than the U.S. And we can see that Western Europe and Northern Europe has the highest concentration of women in political or parliament power positions. Okay, demographic indicators. We look at life expectancy, the longevity of a human life. We look at infant mortality rate. We look at the natural increase rate, so population growth. We look at the crude birth rate. We look at the dependency ratio, which we learned in population pyramids. And we also look at gender ratio, which we learned about in population pyramids. We look at life expectancy. We see that people that live in more developed countries live longer than people in less developed countries. We can see that the lowest life expectancy is sub-Saharan Africa, which you learned about in population as the fastest growing natural increase rate of countries in the world. Gender Inequality Index is another measurement. It's more commonly used. It's more accurate than GDI. The Gender Inequality Index takes specific variables to women. It doesn't compare men and women. It takes a look at women and the improvement. So we can see women improvement is highest in regions where traditionally women lived in patriarch societies where they were oppressed by their male counterpart, such as Southwest Asia or Northern Africa or Central and South America.